Shalom, everybody, and welcome to Youth for Torah, where we dig deep into God's Word to know more about Him. Today, we're going to talk about Parasha number 6 that corresponds to yesterday's Shabbat. Parasha number 6 is titled Toldot. We can find it in Genesis 25:19 through Genesis 28:9. Toldot is the word or the name that is used for this Parasha, because in verse 19 it says, "Here is the Toldot of Yitzchak. Here is the generations of Yitzchak." Toldot is the plural form of the word Toledah, generation, and the root word for Toledah would be Yalad. Yalad means to bring forth, to bear, or to beget. In other words, that which is issued from Yitzchak. In other words, his seed, his children. So, we're going to see who these children are, what are the following reasons going to be, and how this is important for this parasha. We then see that Yitzchak was 40 years old when he took Rivka as his wife, and if we look back at the previous parasha, we know that Yitzchak was 37 when his mother Sarah died. So we can see that he got married approximately 3 years later. Then we see that in verse 21 that Yitzchak prayed to Adonai on behalf of his wife because she was childless. Adonai heeded his prayer and Rivka became pregnant. Does this sound familiar? If we remember, Yitzchak's mother was also barren. Sarah had to pray and pray and pray along with Abraham in order for Yitzchak to be born. And as we can see here, Yitzchak, when he started to pray for Rivka to become pregnant, he was 40 years old. And if later on we read in chapter 25, we can see that Yitzchak was 60 years old when Rivka gave birth to his twins. So it took approximately 20 years in order for Rivka to get pregnant. It was 20 years that they had to wait, and it was 20 years that Rivka was barren. This teaches us a very important lesson, that Elohim is master over all, and he is the creator of mankind, and he decides when to open and or when to close the womb whenever he wants to. Why? Because he is in control of everything and he has a time for everything. He knows when a person ought to give birth to a child and when it's not the time to give birth to a child. Adonai has the whole universe under his control, and he takes care of each and every one of the lives of each and every one of his children. So why is this important for us to keep in mind, that Adonai is in control of everything and Adonai decides to whom give children, how many children that person should have, and if that person should have children at all? It's important for us to know that, because nowadays we must know that society is always going to try to find a way to go against what God has taught us. And that is why I want to mention the danger of Planned Parenthood. This is exclusively important to know. Why? First of all, let's see why Planned Parenthood was created. What is its objective? Planned Parenthood was created in order to control the amount of children per family and to prevent unwanted pregnancies. Now, who is the target? Who, or better said, who makes use of this agenda, of this Planned Parenthood? People who go against Torah. Who? People who have sex before matrimony, and or people that have sex with multiple partners. Not only is this a high risk for sexually transmitted diseases, but this is also one of the main reasons why the incidence of teenage pregnancies is increasing. So with that in mind, not only are we allowing people not to take concern and caution in how they act, but also we are not allowing them to assume the consequences of their actions. We are defying God by taking control of something that only God should be in control of. And in a way, we are acting in would be considered an act of rebellion. Why? Because we are allowing people to decide to how many kids to have. We're allowing people to decide, to make the decisions that could affect them, could affect their future generations, and could affect society. And we're telling God that He is not the one in control. That's why we have to be careful with these organisms or these organizations created by society that are trying to defy God. So, later on with the story, we see that Rivka does indeed become pregnant, and she becomes pregnant with twins. But the children fought together inside her to the point of her desiring not to exist. The battle that they had in her was excruciating, was extremely bad. I cannot imagine how bad it must have been, or what the children were doing in her womb, but to want not to exist must have been terrible. So, since the quarreling was excessive, she goes to inquire of Adonai, who responds her with an important prophecy. In Genesis 25:23, we see, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples will be separated from your body. 1 people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. So this is the Toldot of Yitzhak. 2 nations, 2 people. And what it actually says in the second part is that the 2 peoples will be separated or will be divided. Here it says, 2 nations are in your womb. So we know that this is the Toldot of Yitzhak. And it says that these 2 people, these 2 nations, will be separated from your body. In other words, that even before birth, they were to be 2 completely different individuals. They were not going to be the same, but they will be opposites. One was meant to be set apart. They were not going to be able to become one because they were actually going to be rivals. And only one of these 2 could carry on Abraham's blessing and promise of being the chosen nation and inheriting the land, the promised land, the future land. So that leads us to the next part. Who were they, and which one was going to be the chosen one, in another word, or in other words? It says, 1 people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. In other words, the younger one was to be stronger and was to be over the older one. In other words, the lineage of Abraham and Yitzhak was to be continued through the younger one. Okay, so with that, let's meet the twins. The first twin to come out, twin number 1, was reddish and covered with hair. Hence the name Esav. They named him Esav, which means completely formed, because he already had hair at birth. Then twin number 2 emerges, and he came out holding onto Esav's heel. And that's why they named him Yaakov, which means heel or supplanter. So these are the 2 brothers, Esav. Esav comes from the root word asa. Asa in Hebrew means to do or to make. In other words, from that word comes Esav, which means to be completely made, completely formed. In other words, someone that had achieved completion or perfection in a way. Yaakov, on the other hand, Yaakov comes from the Hebrew word akev. Akev means heel or supplanter, someone who takes the place of the other. This is extremely important because, as we have seen in previous Bible studies, a name is not only a simple word or some title or something that we're called by, but a name actually has a meaning, and that meaning could change drastically our lives and how we live. It defines us in a way. Just like Elohim has his many names that describe his different characteristics or try to give us a glimpse of who he is, our names also show and tell who we are. So we're also going to see how Yaakov, later on in the Parasha, how he does fulfill the meaning of his name. Then verses 27 to 28 go on to describe what the 2 men developed to become. Esav became a skillful hunter, so he was an outdoorsman. He was more of an of an activity person, one who would go to hunt and bring game. He was constantly in the field. He was an outdoor guy. Yaakov, on the other hand, was a quiet man, so he tended to the flocks, stayed near the tents, stayed near his family. Yitzhak is mentioned to favor Esav, while Rivka favored Yaakov. Now, this is something that's terrible because favoritism always brings trouble, and that's something that we must avoid in a family. Then comes an important part, because here we see how Yaakov starts to fulfill the meaning of his name. From verses 29 to 34, we see that Yaakov had cooked some stew. It doesn't specify what kind of stew, but it says that he cooked a stew. And Esav came from the field faint and weary. So Esav asks Yaakov for some of the red stuff. Now, in our Bibles, we see that it says some of that red stuff. But in Hebrew, it's actually adom. So something like reddy red or extremely red, kind of like emphasizing the fact that it was something very red, but that he had no absolute knowledge of what it was. It was just some red food. Now that word faint or weary that we see in the orange call out is ayef. Ayef here is used to describe how Esav was feeling after being out in the field. But ayef in the Bible is used for different meanings other than physical exertion or exhaustion. To be ayef could mean physical exhaustion or exertion, could also represent emotional stress, and is also used for spiritual struggle. In other words, when someone is faint or weary, that person could be either physically exhausted, could be emotionally stressed or with struggle or struggling emotionally, and the most dangerous of them all could be spiritually weak or spiritually struggling. This is actually quite interesting because we understand it in a way that since Esav was out in the field hunting and using a lot of physical exertion, he could have meant that I'm physically exhausted. But in a way, and we know that Bible has many layers of understanding, Esav was not only physically exhausted, but Esav was also emotionally weak, and he was also spiritually weak. Why? We're going to see right now. For Yaakov to give Esav the red stuff or the red stew, Yaakov asked for his bekorah. He says, bekoratecha, give me your birthright. And Esav, without thinking it twice, sells him the birthright, saying, what is to me the birthright if I'm going to die anyway? And so he despises his birthright and gives it to Yaakov. So first of all, God's prophecy was beginning to fulfill itself, what he had told Rivka. Esav was not the indicated one to carry on Abraham's blessing because he had despised his birthright. Now, why is it so serious to despise a birthright? Isn't a birthright just a title or just the fact that you were born first? Not at all. A birthright was not only an inheritance, a physical or a material inheritance given down by the parents, but it also meant that the person was going to accept his future role in his family, to carry out the family name, to take responsibility of the family, and to be a head, a leader, a special kind of authority that could only be exercised with God's guidance. In other words, Esav was basically saying that he did not want to become leader of the family. He did not want to take on the responsibilities of taking care of his family, and he most definitely did not care what was the destiny of his family or what was going to happen to his family. So this proves to show how spiritually weak Esav was, because he did not care about God's plan for him. How emotionally weak he was, because he decided to put first his physical needs over what he should have known that was the right thing to do. And of course, he was physically exhausted because of hunting. So by giving it up for something as insignificant as a stew, he was basically saying, I care about myself only, not at all about my family or God's plans for me. So that's why he receives a new name. His name changes. Remember, names are important. He was changed from Esav to Edom. Now remember, Esav meant to be completely formed. In other words, a complete person, a person that lacked nothing. But Esav demonstrated that he lacked spiritual strength, he lacked emotional intelligence, and he lacked the strength to put on the responsibility of being the next family leader. So he proved that he was not worthy of being Esav. In other words, he was not worthy of being completely formed. So his name is changed to Edom. Edom comes from Adam, that means red. And as we remember, it said just the red stuff, something insignificant, something that is not even mentioned as to what it was, what kind of vegetables were used, or if it had meat. It's just a thing. So he goes from being something completely formed to something completely insignificant as a red thing. He was born with a purpose and a future, but considered it insignificant, therefore, he himself became a red thing, something insignificant. Then we go on to chapter 26, and it says that a famine comes over the land, and Yitzhak went to Gerar, to Avimelech, king of the Plishtim. Now, the Plishtim, if we remember from Genesis 10:14, were descendants of Mitzrayim, that were descendants of Ham, one of Noah's children. Elohim ordered Yitzhak not to go down to Egypt, but to stay in the land. Then Elohim goes on to repeat his promise to Yitzhak and adds something quite interesting. We can see that from Genesis 26, 2-5. It says, Adonai appeared to him and said, Don't go down into Egypt, but live where I will tell you. Stay in this land, and I will be with you and bless you, because I will give all these lands to you and to your descendants. I will fulfill the oath which I swore to Abraham your father. I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky. I will give all these lands to your descendants, and by your descendants all the nations of the earth will bless themselves. Again, there is the promise, but this is the interesting thing that Adonai adds. All this is because Abraham heeded what I said and did what I told him to do. He followed my mitzvot, my regulations, and my teachings. So it's not only that you receive a promise for free. What that promise or that blessing that Adonai bestowed upon Abraham, then Yitzhak, and we will see later on to Yaakov, is a beautiful demonstration of God's love. But love goes both ways. That was his way of showing how he loves us, and the only thing he asks in return is obedience to his word. And Abraham fulfilled that. He did that. And if we remember, Abraham is the father of faith. Faith never goes alone. Abraham believed in what Adonai told him, but he put his faith into action. In other words, he put his faith into works. What works? Obeying Torah. And we know that faith by itself cannot be. Faith needs actions in order to be alive. We can see that in James 2:17, where it says, even so, faith, if it has no works, is dead in itself. Faith without actions is dead, and faith with actions is how we show God that we love him. So yes, Abraham believed, and it was credited to him as righteousness. But in order to have living faith, one must also do works. What works? Torah. Then we see from verses 6-11, Yitzhak, just like his father Abraham, said that Rivka was his sister, so that they wouldn't kill him on account of her because she was beautiful. And after a long time of living with the Plishtim, when Avimelech looks out of the window, he sees that Yitzhak was caressing Rivka. And then we see how he says, how could you tell us that she was your sister when she is in fact your wife? We could have committed a great sin by sleeping with her and then that guilt would have been on our heads. So let's rewind a bit and let's ask ourselves a few questions. First of all, was this Avimelech the same Avimelech that Abraham encountered? It could be because we later on see in verse 26 that when he goes to visit Yitzhak, he goes with his commander Fikol. Now, Fikol was also mentioned in Abraham's time in Genesis 21:22. So this Avimelech could have been the same Avimelech that Abraham talked to. But on the other hand, some commentators suggest that both Avimelech and Fikol were titles. Just like in Egypt, Pharaoh was a title for the highest person in the land, so there were many pharaohs. Avimelech could have been a title for the leaders of the Plishtim, like all of the leaders. It could have been a way of saying like king or emperor. The same for Fikol could have been a way of calling the commander of the Plishtim army. We also have to consider that the Plishtim were descendants of Mitzrayim. In other words, they did come from the descendants of the Egyptians, so they could have had similar traditions. So Abimelech could have seen Abraham, or this could have been his descendant and making him the new king or Abimelech. Another thing that is quite interesting to point out is that in both occasions, Abimelech had the notion or principle that laying with another man's wife was wrong. Of course, we know that they weren't righteous because of the different acts that they did from that time, even later on when Israel becomes a nation. But they did have some notion of some things that were wrong, and this was one of them, that they could not commit adultery. Then we see that while Yitzhak was with Abimelech, Adonai blessed Yitzhak 100-fold. Now this is beautiful because if we remember, they were going through a famine, and yet God shows that he always protects and takes care of his loved ones, of his children, to the point of, even in a moment of famine, blessing them 100-fold. And since he had grown rich and great, Abimelech told Yitzhak to leave. And we also see that the Plishtim were very envious people and that they didn't like to see others prosper. Why? Because they would constantly quarrel with Yitzhak's servants and they would stop up all the wells that they had dug. And that's why I mentioned previously that some of their behaviors were not excusable. That kind of behavior of not wanting to see people prosper, not wanting people to be happy, that kind of envy destroys people. Now this envy later is going to cause important quarrels with the servants of Yitzhak. We see that the servants of Yitzhak dug a well. That was the first well that they dug. And the Plishtim come and quarrel with the servants of Yitzhak to the point that Yitzhak just says, I'm going to leave and dig somewhere else. So they call that first well Esek, meaning contention. Then we see that they go further away and then they dig up a second well. And again, the Plishtim, out of envy and out of hate, quarrel with them to the point of Yitzhak again leaving and going further on. And the name for this second well is Sitna, which means hostility or enmity. What's interesting is that this word Sitna comes from the word Satan. It means adversary. So we can extract two lessons from this. First of all, the behavior that feeds on envy has its origin in the enemy. So we ought to avoid this behavior at all costs. In other words, envy, jealousy, hate, anger all lead us to be connected to the adversary, to the enemy. And we do not want that. And the second point is, as children of God, we might have to face people like this that constantly cause quarrels with us, even though we don't want to fight with them. But the closer we are to God, the more the enemy will try to bother us. So don't feel bad if you're going through a certain trial where someone is being mean to you. God in heaven is looking at that, and he in the end will give you a solution. And that takes us to the third well. That's Rehovot. Rehovot is the third well that Yitzhak builds, and then he finds peace. And that's where he says God has given me a broad place to live in, broad places. That's why that well is called Rehovot. So with this, we can see that trials or quarrels or hard times with people aren't eternal, and God will always bring us out of them and give us a peaceful place to be. So Yitzhak goes on to Beersheba, that's in the Negev, well, close to the Negev, and builds an altar and calls on the name of Adonai. So then we later see that Avimelech comes and wants to make a pact. Yitzhak says, but you literally were the one that kicked me out. But Avimelech recognizes that they should be friends and that they shouldn't fight. So he goes on to make a pact with Avimelech. His servants, right at that moment, found water in that place. And so they made another well, a fourth well. So with that, they call that place Beersheba. Beer meaning well, and Sheva meaning pact or a covenant. What's interesting is that Sheva is actually the Hebrew word for the number 7. So every time we see the word, the number 7 in the Bible, we can understand it, or we can analyze it as it having to do with a pact or a covenant. Kind of like with the Shabbat. The Shabbat is on the 7th day of the week, and it is God's pact or God's covenant with us of bringing us into his rest. So it's kind of a cool and beautiful thing to keep in mind. Then we see in verse 34 that Esav goes and marries 2 women. These 2 women were of the Hittites. He married them at the age of 40. Now, the Hittites, we know that are descendants of Ham, and that they were part of the 7 nations that lived in the land of Canaan. And these 2 women were a cause of embitterment for the spirit of Yitzhak and Rivka. I want you guys to keep this in mind, because we're going to see that later on, how this is important as well. Very well. Now we have reached chapter 27, and here is where Yaakov brings about the complete importance and prophecy of his name. In this chapter, we see that Yaakov's name is fulfilled. Now, there are various opinions as to whether the means by which it came to pass were the correct ones. So let's analyze this chapter. First of all, both Yitzhak and Rivka knew that because of what God had said, Yaakov was supposed to be the one to receive the blessing. Yaakov was meant to supplant Esav, but Yitzhak calls Esav instead of Yaakov. Why? The Torah doesn't say, but it could have been because he favored Esav. Rivka listened to what Yitzhak had told Esav and comes up with a plan in order for Yaakov to be the one to receive the blessing. What's interesting about this plan that Rivka made and that Yaakov follows is that it actually supplants everything. So it kind of Yaakov's everything. How? First of all, the meal. In verse 4, we see that Yitzhak says to Esav, "Make it tasty the way I like it." Rivka says, "I will make it tasty the way he likes it." So in this way, the food was supplanted. The food was Yaakoved. Then we see that the son is also supplanted. Yaakov was the complete opposite of Esav, yet Yaakov had to transform into Esav in order to supplant Esav. He puts on Esav's garments and goat fur to pass as Esav. The only thing that could not be mimicked was the voice. And because of that, we see that Yitzhak doubts a bit, but in the end, he falls for it. Then we go on to verses 28 to 29, that is the bracha, the blessing. Now, before we go into the blessing itself, first of all, we have to see that the blessing of a parent was more than just a collection of words. A blessing was, in some way, a prophecy. It would help trace the future of the son that was receiving the blessing and what he was to receive from God Most High, how the characteristics of his descendants were going to be, and what position they were to have amongst the other nations. In other words, with that, basically, the parent would tell the child how his future was going to be. So now let's take a look at the blessing itself. It says, So may God give you dew from heaven, the richness of the earth, and the grain and wine in abundance. May people serve you and nations bow down to you. May you be lord over your kinsmen. Let your mother's descendants bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be everyone who blesses you. So, first of all, we're going to see what he was to receive. It says here, God will give you. So this was his inheritance, a material inheritance. It says, dew from heaven, richness of the earth, grain and wine in abundance. In other words, the land of Israel. If we see Deuteronomy 11, 10 from 15, in this case I've only put 10 from 12, it says, for the land you are about to enter and take over is not like the land of Egypt from which you came, where you planted your seed and made irrigation ditches with your foot as in a vegetable garden. Rather, the land you will take over is a land of hills and valleys with plenty of rain, a land that the Lord your God cares for. He watches over it through each season of the year. So this richness from heaven, this richness from earth, grain and wine in abundance, was basically the promise of inheriting the land of Israel. That was going to be for Yaakov. Second, as we see here, is Yaakov's position. Was he to be a servant or was he to be a leader? His position was to be head over his kinsmen, and we can see that in Deuteronomy 28:13. And the Lord will make you the head and not the tail. You shall be above only and not be beneath. He was to rule over the nations surrounding him. And then we see an important part of the blessing where it's a protection and shared blessing. In other words, this part of the blessing was to protect Yaakov's descendants and also to multiply the blessings not only to Yaakov's descendants but to all the nations around Yaakov. How? It says, cursed be anyone who curses you, and blessed be everyone who blesses you. So when someone would try to lay a curse on the descendants of Yaakov, that curse would be repelled and would be headed back and given to the people that intended to curse Israel. And then it says, blessed be everyone who blesses you. In other words, not only was Yaakov to be blessed, but the ones around Yaakov, the Goim, all the rest of the nations, those that blessed Yaakov would also be in turn blessed. We can see later on in Psalm 102:6 where it says, pray for the peace of Jerusalem, of Jerusalem. They shall prosper those that love thee. So after the blessing is given, we see that Esau returns. We see that when he comes, it's already too late, and that Yitzhak finds out about the deception that had been taken. And Esau starts to pout and starts to cry and starts to whine and wants to receive a blessing himself. And again, we see here how it was more important for Esau to receive rather than to be obedient and do for his family. For him, it was more important to receive the blessing of his father than to be ahead of his family. So we then see Esau's blessing was a short blessing, but it's also giving us a glimpse of how the people of Edom were going to be. It says, here, your home will be of the richest of the earth and of the dew of heaven from above. You will live by your sword and you will serve your brother, but when you break loose, you will shake his yoke off your neck. So he was to be the servant, he was to be under Yaakov, and it says that he was going to live by the sword. So he would have food, he was going to be supplied with food, but the thing is, he was going to have a hard time getting it. Living by the sword not only meant hunting for food or having to get food in a hard way, but actually having to fight constantly to remain alive. For example, we can see that in Deuteronomy 2:12, that in order for Edom to get his inheritance, that was Mount Seir, they had to drive away a huge people of giants. We're talking about the Horim. Esau needed to defeat all the Horim in order to receive Mount Seir. Later on, we can also see that there is true enmity between Edom and Israel. When Israel sets its first king, Shaul, we see in 1 Samuel 14:47 where it says, "So Saul took the kingdom over Israel and fought against all his enemies on every side, against Moab, against the children of Ammon, against Edom, and against the kings of Zobah, and against the Plishtim. And whithersoever he turned himself, he vexed them." So we can see that Israel was in a constant fight with Edom. We see then that just like Cain, he got angry with his brother to the point of wanting to kill his brother. Again, showing how spiritually weak he was because he was allowing the enemy to direct his soul. Then we go on to chapter 28. Now, we see in verses 1 through 4 that it's quite interesting that Yitzhak doesn't mention at all to Yaakov of what had happened between the two brothers. Now, if they had the conversation of the deception, the Bible does not mention it. But when Yitzhak does in fact talk to Yaakov, it's not to reprimand him or to tell him about the whole incident with Esav, but he instead goes on to bless Yaakov and charges him to take a wife from his mother's family. Why was this so important? Abraham did the same thing for Yitzhak. He did not allow Yitzhak to marry any of the Canaanite women or any of the women of the surrounding countries. And the reason behind this is of spiritual importance. If we see Deuteronomy 7:3-4, it says, "Furthermore, you shall not intermarry with them. You shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor you shall take their daughters for your sons, for they will turn your sons away from following me to serve other gods. Then the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and he will quickly destroy you." In other words, marrying pagans separates people from God. Is this important today? Absolutely. When seeking a partner for life, the feature of the significant other must be her relationship with God. Otherwise, you will be enticed to leave God and you will no longer be connected with him. We also see how Yaakov is the chosen one to carry on the Abrahamic blessing and the inheritance of the land of Canaan. So Yaakov obeyed and went, and we will see that in the next parasha of how he actually fulfills and is obedient. Esav, on the other hand, had married Canaanite women, which were causing him to be spiritually weak, causing him to have problems with his family. And when he sees that Yitzhak sends Yaakov to marry an ideal woman, Esav continues to choose wrong, and he goes on to marry one of Ishmael's daughters. Again, going to a people that will pull him away from his creator. So, with that, we have concluded Parasha number 6, that's Toldot. We have to now study for the next Parasha Vayetze. And with that, I wish you all a very blessed week, a Shavua Tov. And just to remind each and every one of you that in this life we have to constantly fight different trials of temptation, of bad people that constantly want to hurt us, that constantly want to bring us down. But we mustn't forget that we have our Elohim that is constantly by our side, guiding us, protecting us, blessing us, and helping us little by little reach the promised land. But we must not forget that in order to do so, we must and always have to obey his word, obey his commandments, obey his Torah. May you all have a blessed week, and may God bless you. Thank you very much.